Brad, this had to have been a great adventure for you.
Oh man, I mean, once in a lifetime, right? It was just incredible. 12,525 miles. I actually spent some time in Charlotte for this.
Did you?
Yeah, and really.
Wow. So what was the adventure like for you?
It was, it was to be able to kind of live out your childhood through this exploration as an adult of, I grew up watching wrestling in Rhode Island in the 80s. And so I saw these guys as these cartoon characters. And now to be able to put a sort of a three-dimensional human perspective on them to really understand who they are and what they dealt with. And I, part of the book was going back to their hometowns and seeing where they grew up and trying to get a sense of who they were before they were the characters in the ring. And then to what extent they became those characters because they were expected back in the 70s and 80s to live their character 24/7.
I've been blessed with the opportunity to interview a lot of these wrestlers, and I think one of the things that fascinates me the most is how down to earth they are. And then you talk about the character, you break down the character and stuff like that. And I just love how passion driven they are to bring those storylines together.
Yeah, and what's interesting is several of the guys in this book. So I wrote about Sergeant Slaughter,
yes,
and Tito Santana, Hulk Hogan, the Iron Sheik. And several of them, when I would go and I would interview people that knew them, whether their family or their childhood friends, they said how shy they were. You watch his work, his interviews, and, he's snarling with a gravelly voice. And, and I think once these guys got comfortable in that role, it almost became this alter ego, this escape hatch for them to have a lot of fun with.
When you got with the wrestlers and they were starting to get more open with the storylines, did they talk about the history of wrestling? Because to me, wrestling is like martial arts. We could not earn our black belts unless we knew the history of Taekwondo.
Yeah, and that's part of, so in the book, there's a whole chapter where I trace the history of pro wrestling. Where did it come from?
Yes.
And I didn't know that when I started my research, that it really started out as this combination of collar and elbow style wrestling, which came over from Ireland in the 1800s, and then catch wrestling from parts of the UK, mixed in with a little bit of football, a little bit of Greco-Roman wrestling.
Yep.
And so initially, wrestling, what we call pro wrestling didn't really exist until about the turn of the 20th century. Before then, you had matches that were like 9 hours long, right? So you can tell why they had to make it stage, because no one wants to watch two guys sit on the ground for 9 hours grabbing each other. And so the history was important to tell. I actually also went in the ring and did a day of training myself to know what it feels like to hit the ropes and to take a bump. But I think the guys from my era that I wrote about they did have an appreciation, because when they were brought into the wrestling business, when they would get trained back in the 70s, the trainers wouldn't tell them. It wasn't like they would then very, very gradually work. Like the last thing they would show them is how to throw a punch or a kick, because that's, not amateur style. So they would first do a lot of the, how to hit the mat and different, more traditional wrestling moves.
Dude, I totally relate with that, because in martial arts, we were trained how to fall. That was the main thing. I came here to kick butt, man. No, learn how to fall. Start landing on your back. Learn how to do it.
Yeah, the first thing I did when I did that day of training was learn how to take a fall over and over again. And, if you don't distribute your weight just right on that, the ring itself is like a half an inch of hard foam over plywood on a steel frame. So there is spring. It's not like a boxing mat, but when I took a bump and if I didn't land exactly right, I would get my bell rung, and you can see just how real that is.
Dude, I'll never forget when Harley Race came to Billings, Montana, and the ring didn't arrive, and they put stuff down on that Shrine Auditorium floor, and he still fought. I just thought, man, that's a wrestler. He's going to walk away.
Were you there in person for that?
Yes, I was. That's back in the day when Bret Hart was a punk little kid, man, and the Dynamite Kid and everybody.
So you were out in the AW, like out in the West, in the AWA back
Yes, I was, and Stu Hart was the one that brought it in from Canada. But then we never got the Nick Botwinkles into Billings or anything like that, because I just felt like that Stu Hart had owned our part of the country.
Yeah, man, that was this is some great stories from back there, and you're right. Sometimes the ring wouldn't show up, and so they would just have a match on the mat and probably do a lot of chain wrestling and a lot of mat wrestling. And someone like Harley Race, he was as fierce as they came when it came to protecting the business.
Now, when you had that partnership with Iron Sheik and things went wrong, you write about it in the book. I mean, it's like, are you looking over your shoulder, or is everything pretty cool now?
Oh, he passed away.
Yeah, but family though.
Oh, well, I mean, so if you can tell in the book, I mean, I know the family really well.
Yes.
Very, very close with his daughter and his wife. And I think when you read the book, that first chapter, the prologue is, it's not exactly flattering, but you see the whole arc of the story. And the book begins with that, but it ends with me going and seeing him again in 2022. And you can see how much things have improved. So I think hopefully the happy ending will make it all fall together.
The wrestling world is up the WWF.
Well, I think Crockett and Mid-Atlantic, Charlotte, Greensboro, you're underrated. You deserve more credit for having the first Starrcade and that closed circuit.
That's it. Yep.
They did closed circuit pay-per-view, or not pay-per-view, but closed circuit major event before the WWF did. And so they're pioneers in that sense. I think Vince McMahon, the WWF did it in a way that had more impact in the mainstream and sort of culturally, because basically he was in New York City and Madison Square Garden. He got Muhammad Ali and Liberace and all those celebrities. And I don't think Crockett didn't have that, right? So Crockett was always fighting that stigma of, you're just a local regional wrestling territory, versus Vince McMahon, who was able to create this national reach.
Did you get any opportunity to speak with Terry Allen, Magnum TA? Because, I mean, I really honestly thought that when he was in that ring, we were falling witness to the next Ric Flair.
And maybe he would have been Ric Flair or even a Hogan type in that, he had that magnetism, that charisma, the look. I did not get to talk to him, but I did see they did a Dark Side of the Ring show on him recently. Yep. And that tells the story of, how tragic it, because he was on the fast track for sure.
Yeah. What is it about wrestling that connects people together? I mean, we could be sitting here talking to a 92-year-old man or a 12-year-old kid, and we would all be on the same page.
I think it's that escapism. I think it's the storytelling. I think the things that propel wrestling and make it popular are these universal themes or constructs that appeal to like our human condition, right? The good versus evil. The anxiety or on your, in wrestling that you could never say yourself in real life. That's cathartic. That's a chance to lose yourself in some character, in some fantasy. And so I think it's a little bit of sort of fantasy escapism. Do
you like the way that wrestling is growing in the way of being more reality TV driven? I mean, because over the weekend I watched a show where Stephanie has teamed up with her husband, and they're going with the wrestlers to get their memorabilia back from fans. I'm going, oh my God, is it okay to take it back from fans? I mean, does it really belong to the WWE?
Well, the Hidden Treasure show. Yeah, I think that those things are cool because they're usually like compensating the fans, and they're usually saying, oh, this is going to go in our archive, or it's going to go on display at WrestleMania's events. So I don't have a problem with them. I mean, making that effort. And I think by being part of that show, the fans get something out of it as well. So I do like that when the promoters let people behind the curtain and kayfabe ended, it kind of felt more inclusive. It was sort of like everyone was in on it together versus some of the more adversarial, like, oh, this is, trying to fool people, or say this is real, competition.
Yeah, I would love to do some research on how people are going to read this book. I think they're going to go chapter, not 1, 2, 3, but they're going to go throughout the book and pick out what their points of interest, and then they're going to go back and reread the book.
Well, I do hope that they read it from beginning to end at some point, because it does, although there are these discrete chapters where I go, okay, here's a chapter on the Iron Sheik, or here's one on Sergeant Slaughter. There's an overarching narrative to the book, which is, me on the road. You guys had experience working in Charlotte. I actually when I was in Charlotte, I went to the Park Center, which is where Tony Atlas first trained, just so I could see the building, and took some pictures of it. And so I think when you read it all the way through, you also see how interconnected these guys are. So when I go to Tony Atlas, he can share stories about the Iron Sheik, and I actually ended up passing some messages back and forth, because these guys often don't talk to each other that much anymore. Maybe they see each other at a convention. So I took some video of one guy giving a little hello message, and I would play it for the other guy. And that was kind of cool to be able to be the messenger between them.
When you were at that park and doing your investigating, outside that building was the Bojangles Arena. That building holds so much history when it comes to professional wrestling. Did you step in there and at least feel the energy?
Oh man, I wish I had. I did not do that. But I have a lot of respect. I mean, I grew up in the Northeast, so I was a WWF kid, but I have a lot of respect for those North Carolina venues, Charlotte and Greensboro, and how special they are, how iconic for the Jim Crockett promotion fans.
Yeah, because it got to the point here in Charlotte where, we would, even though the Rock and Roll Express was so huge, we would cheer on the other guys, the bad guys, and just to rile up the fans, to kind of piss them off a bit.
Well, I think that the NWA, Charlotte, Mid-Atlantic, down there was always a bit more of an edge, like the heels. There was more appreciation for the work rate of the wrestlers, and the matches were probably just better in-ring matches than what you had in the WWF. And I think the fans there, maybe they're kind of almost the precursors to the quote-unquote smart fans of today.
Turn this book into, it's like a backstage pass. You're giving it to us in a way to where it's going to create conversation. And when say get their hands on it, they're going to want to see you at one of these conventions. Are you going to do that?
Yeah, I'm actually in Philadelphia right now, so I'll be at WrestleCon. So if anyone's going to be at Wrestlemania in Philly for the weekend, come by, say hi. I've also got a new site called thebradpack.com, where I collected all this wrestling history as part of my research, like internal WWF documents showing how much this pay-per-view made or how much this guy got paid. And so because you can't put all that in the book, I'm going to upload that to the site. And so I hope people will check that out if they're really wrestling, hardcore wrestling fans.
Wow. See, so you've taken their business and made it into a business. I like that. I mean, that's a continuation.
Yeah. Well, it's also it's a hard world out there in publishing these days. So if there's any way to, as a creator, to try to keep it going, and I would love to tell more stories like this, but also got to pay the rent, right?
Yeah. So I like your line here when you say that it's a subculture without a cultural home. I like that because it's like it's there, but it's not there, but it's there.
Right. And that is in trying to define wrestling, it doesn't fit neatly into any category, which also I think is why wrestlers themselves are still not really properly protected when it comes to their profession, the working conditions, because they're not quite actors, they're not quite athletes, right? And so there is no, and I get into this in the book, that there's no union, they have no retirement, they have no, they're classified as independent contractors, which is insane, because if you're working for the WWE, they're not going to let you go work for AEW.
Nope.
You're not really an independent contractor. And yet that persists to this day. So I think that despite all that's changed in wrestling, letting people behind the curtain, some mainstream society still doesn't take them quite seriously enough to affect the reform and the change that we need to better protect them. So the guys that are around now don't end up like some of the guys I wrote about in my book, where they're, Tony Atlas is 70 years old and he's still wrestling because he needs to financially.
Wow. One thing I did not understand as a kid is that because being up there in Montana, we got to see what they were doing in Denver, which was Nick Botwinkle, and then we had the Bret Harts, and we also had Bob Backlund. The thing is, I didn't understand as a kid, why weren't they fighting? So what we would do is that we would buy those darn wrestling magazines, and we would create our own matches, and then take each other on in our living rooms.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, we all had our own ways of acting it out, right? Like it was the magazines, it was the backyard wrestling, it was my poor sister who endured me trying to put the figure 4 leg lock on so many times, to the point where she would just like lay there being bored, like, are you done yet trying to put on this fake move? So I think that I think people now who are now in their 40s, 50s, Generation X, we grew up in the pre-internet days, and so this book is really a chance to go back to those days and evoke that nostalgia.
Did you write it as a fan or as a journalist?
Well, I think you're a liar when you do these projects, if you say that you're not at all a fan. You're a human, right? You're still a fan. You can't fully suppress that. But I think I did as good a job as I could about being a journalist and taking that seriously, that objectivity, because I went and I asked guys some hard questions. I asked Tito Santana about his the daughter he found out about recently, and I was trying to ask Sergeant Slaughter about whether he served in Vietnam or not, and that was a whole storyline. So yeah, I was not afraid to shy away. I didn't shy away from asking some tough questions.
Wow. You got to come back to this show anytime in the future. And next time you come to Charlotte, we got to get together and have a face-to-face, dude.
Yeah, I'd love it. I appreciate you having me on, and it's fun to talk to someone that knows wrestling as well as you do.
Thank you so much. You be brilliant today, okay?
All right, take care.